Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this event. This is the University of California, Riverside Inland Center for Sustainable Development, or ICSD. We're really thrilled to have you here as we release a report that is a compilation of research and guidance from our Leadership Council over the course of the last year and a half. And let me see, Kristen, can we get something on the screen? Can we get the presentation on the screen? There we go. Great. Okay, so we're going to move through the opening remarks. As my understanding is both the Dean and Ron Leverage are coming here late, but hopefully they'll be able to join us and they can provide some perspective. So I'll just provide the opening remarks. Again, thank you very much for being here. And we hope that this next hour or so will be informative. And I dare to say exciting for all of you that are listening and participating. Make sure if you have questions that you provide them to us through the chat, and we'll try to monitor the questions and feed them to the panelists or staff as we go. Next slide. So the Inland Center for Sustainable Development is one of 4 programs that is housed within UCR's School of Public Policy. Anil Dililakar is the Dean of SPP. The Inland Center was started about a year and a half ago. As you can see, the staff there under Anil's guidance, Ron Leverage is one of the founding members of ICSD. He serves as a senior advisor. My name is Rick Bishop. I'm the external director for ICSD. We have Dr. Chenfang Wang. She is with a UCR faculty. She serves as our internal director overseeing much of the research. We also have Dr. Wei Kang. She is one of our research analysts and has done much of the work on the COVID-related reports that are contained in our final document. Kristen Kopko is our project analyst, and I wanted also to mention that today is her last day with us. So she is leaving UCR and ICSD to pursue a master's in public policy at the Harris School in Chicago, where she'll be relocating over the course of the next 2 years. And so we wish her all the best. And I just wanted to kind of call her out and say thank you very much for all the great work you've done for us, Kristen. And then finally, Johanna White is a project analyst who will be starting right after Kristen leaves us. So she's taking Kristen's place. She's our new project analyst, and we're really thrilled to have her on board. And she's also here as part of this event. Thanks. Next slide. So the objectives of the center are really simple, is that we believe that the region, the inland region of San Bernardino and Riverside County really needs a center and an honest broker to take a look at some of the policy issues that impact future growth in the 2 inland counties, which, as you all know, are among the fastest growing areas, continuing to be the fastest growing areas in the state and the nation. Our agenda is guided and overseen by a leadership council. The leadership council is comprised of representatives from the sponsor entities. ICSD is completely funded by private and public sector sponsor entities, and each of those entities has a place on our leadership council. And so they provide us with the direction that we need to pursue our research. To take a look at a listing of all the sponsors, please visit the website that you see there on the screen, and we'll refer to that website later on in the presentation. Next slide. So our focus this first year of the center was housing, and it was really unanimous among our group. Housing is seen as continuing to be a major issue, not just in California, but very much so in the Inland Empire, the nation, and the world for that matter. And so it made perfect sense for us to take a look at housing. And in fact, the overall goal of ICSD initially was that we would take direction from the Leadership Council to look at a particular issue each year. And as we were presenting our results to our Leadership Council this past few months, they determined that we should continue to focus on housing for another year. So there's too much that you can even address in a single year. So we're going to stick on it for the next year, and we appreciate that direction that we have. Next slide.
So I noticed Ron and Anil are now on the panel. So did you want to have them give their remarks now or later?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's do that. If you could, if we could go back to that slide with their pictures, that would be fantastic. And let me first welcome Dean Anil Dililakar. He's the Dean of the School of Public Policy. He oversees ICSD. And then Dr. Ron Loveridge, who I mentioned before, is our Deputy Director and Senior Advisor. So Dean, have at it.
Thank you, Rick. One of the unenviable aspects of, actually enviable aspects of my job is that I have absolutely nothing to do, yet I can get all the credit for this project and this great team. We have a wonderful team here, and I just wanted to sort of say welcome to all of you to this first major report of the ICSD after its year and a half in operation. I am really proud of what the ICSD team led by Doctors Bishop, Wong, and Loveridge have been able to accomplish. And of course, I shouldn't, as I always told Kristen Kopko, we had far too many generals in this team and not enough soldiers. And Kristen and Wei and others have really been great soldiers who have formed the backbone of the entire team. And so I'm really proud at the sort of final report that they have been able to come up with, but with really all of the intermediate outputs that you have seen over the last year and a half. The seminars, the podcasts, the bulletins, and the policy briefs. And you know, this is obviously the entire sort of board had agreed when we started this project that the single biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges facing the inland region was the housing shortage and the affordability crisis. And I'm glad the ICSD team has really pulled all the available information together and come up with some very sound recommendations and steps to take forward. So thank you again for all of you for participating in our group and being the friends, philosophers, and guides of the ICSD. And now it is my honor to pass the proverbial mic on to Ron Loveridge, whose baby the ICSD is.
Neil, thank you very much. Kudos to all those involved in ICSD, its co-directors, the Leadership Council, staff, supporters, and friends. The objective, the rationale of the center is to examine a pressing, serious problem facing inland Southern California. The center draws on the resources of UCR and the School of Public Policy to be the honest broker. Extensive research and listening and literature reviews have been completed. They provide the content for opportunities and challenges for housing in the inland region. It is a report that should be widely shared and read. It provides information, it presents context, it highlights policy choices. It is a go-to source for understanding housing in the inland region. And I look forward to the afternoon program.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron and Anil, for providing those comments. Appreciate it very much. And thanks for your dedication and for allowing the center to move forward. So interestingly, it was only a few months ago that I had a conversation with a prominent individual in the Inland Empire, and he made a comment to me, what does housing have to do with sustainability? And at first I was really taken back, but I thought, you know, it really does deserve a high level response at least. And so I initially had about 5 slides. Kristen can attest to that, you know, that was going off on, you know, what this issue was, but it's really pretty simple. I mean, housing is where quality of life begins and exists for people. It's the high cost of housing is certainly negatively affecting our economies as people, especially those who are constrained and having to spend more than 30% of their income on mortgage. And there's a high number of those in our 2 counties. It puts communities at a competitive disadvantage. And quite frankly, it provides less disposable income for people to spend on other things that can boost the economic outcomes for cities and counties. Climate change is here. It's something that The PPIC just came out with a poll today and showed that 63% of people are very worried about climate change and its impacts on our ability to stay resilient and keep our economy going. 1 in 4 people in the PPIC poll mentioned that it was the single biggest environmental issue facing Californians. And it's big because housing, residential energy use accounts for about 20% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have to be thinking about the energy side of our future housing stock. And then, you know, our populations are changing. And just one example, in 20 years, 2 decades, the number of households with people aged 75 and older is going to double. And last stats that I looked at, and now these are old statistics from about 2012, but it indicated at that time that only about 3% of the nation's housing stock had some of the criteria and components that are really, really valuable for our aging population. That is single entries, wide hallways, things of that nature. So we're going to have to be thinking very differently about what kind of housing and where and for who that we're building in the future. So housing has a lot to do with sustainability, and it's not just from the environmental side, it's from a quality of life side. Next slide. So another common thing that we've heard when we started on this journey to take a look at housing is that there's sort of a false notion that the Inland Empire is where all the housing in the state is being built. And there is a lot of housing that's being built here historically, but it's still not enough. And in fact, if you just take a look in the last decade or so, we are way, way down on the number of houses that are being built both in Riverside and San Bernardino counties compared to where we were recently. The average number of new homes that have been built just in Riverside County alone in the last 5 years has been about 5,000. So we built about 25,000 homes in Riverside County alone in 5 years. But the population in Riverside County grew by 125,000 people. That comes out to about 5 people per household, which is way above what the comfortable averages are. Our median home value in Riverside and San Bernardino counties continues to rise, 500,000, more than 500,000 in Riverside, over $440,000 in San Bernardino. These are data that are a couple months old, so it's probably way higher than that. You've probably seen articles that estimate that the average price home in California by the year 2030 is going to be over $1 million, the average price. So we're not exempt at all from the problem. Next slide, please. So our report goes into some of the issues on why housing is expensive. I think most of the time what you hear is it's a supply and demand issue. There's a lot of truth to that, but you're also taking a look at there's a sizable millennial population that's now garnering the money to look for housing. The supply side is very complicated. We'll talk about some of these things. You've got CEQA regulations, you've got community resistance to housing that remains strong. There's a fiscal calculus issue that we have been exploring recently, and that is, our jurisdiction's really all that hot to want to build housing. They tend to try to strive to seek revenue generating uses on the commercial retail side, and sometimes housing is viewed as a revenue loser. And so it's not really a high priority for local jurisdictions. Can builder pro formas be met? There are buying disparities with family incomes. We note that in the Inland Empire, the cost of housing has basically gone up to the pre-recession levels as far as the cost. But in actuality, family incomes have actually decreased since 2012. So the affordability gap, even in our 2 counties, is growing. And there's got to be some solutions, not just on building more houses, but how do we find ways to increase the incomes in the region to support the housing industry. Next slide, please. So another question that we received a lot as we were on this journey, and that is, does growth stop if new housing isn't built? And the answer is absolutely not. And the data that I just provided in the last slide, Riverside County is a good example of that. If you want to kind of step outside of the region, you don't need to look much farther than, for example, Santa Ana, city of Santa Ana, from 1990 to 2010 actually saw its housing stock go down by about 500 units. Yet its population grew by 44,000 people. So the notion that, if you build it, they will come, the same thing applies is if you don't build it, they will come. Population still is surging. And basically what it does is it just causes existing units to take on more people. They become more overcrowded. And then for local jurisdictions, if you're not building homes and you're just seeing your population grow, you're also not collecting fees that would normally be used to mitigate that new growth. And so you're seeing that systems, public infrastructure systems, are getting severely overtaxed with stagnant growth. So, and then one last thing in that third bullet, interestingly, in 2021, the new geography identified Riverside and San Bernardino metro areas as the third most overcrowded region in the United States, being defined as the number of people per room for a household. And that's just a stunning statistic to me, because I think with most of us even participating in this webinar, we wouldn't, if that was a multiple choice question and there were answers, I don't think that many of us would choose that. I don't think we would see that. Next slide. So the bottom line, housing has a lot to do with sustainability, and sustainable housing is a whole lot more than just energy efficiency. And so we're really looking to create a dialogue among not just our sponsor entities, but the general public and policymakers in the inland counties about, why housing is important. You've heard the term housing is where, jobs go to sleep at night. But we think it's much more than that. It's supportive of educational opportunities. We have Dr. Stephanie Houston as one of our panelists, and she'll be able to talk about that. Good housing in the right places can provide walkability and positive health impacts, access to transportation and healthcare options, and otherwise, meeting the needs of a future changing population, which, as I mentioned earlier, is changing rapidly. And we have to ask ourselves if we're geared up to be able to provide the kind of products for the future population that we're going to have in our two counties. Next slide. So the final report that the ICSD has just turned out is available online. You can read it, you can download it on the website. I'm going to turn this part of the discussion over to Kristen Kopko. Kristen, as was mentioned, has been one of our primary authors in writing materials, along with Dr. Kang, that are included in the report. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to kind of talk and walk you through some of the major components of the report, and then we'll talk about findings and recommendations, and then we'll have a nice panel discussion with 4 experts in the field. Kristen.
Hi everyone. I'm Kristen Kopko. I am a policy analyst here at ICSD, as well as the research manager. Unfortunately, today is my last day before I transfer or really go over to the University of Chicago. But I just want to take a minute and tell everyone at ICSD that you guys it's been so amazing working with you. And this report is really an outcome of how amazing the past few years have been here. So to explain this final report a little bit, it's meant to provide an overview of regional housing issues and showcase our previous year's work and research on housing. And so I'll get into the topics, and then I'll show you a few figures that are a little more interesting than just the text. So we have an inland region profile, which goes over demographics as well as housing stock information. And then we have an analysis of statewide housing policies, which includes a full analysis of the regional housing needs assessment from 1989 to 2029, which is cycles 2 through 6. We have an overview of housing construction in the inland region. Also, we have a section that builds off of a report we did earlier this year about opportunities and challenges for inland housing development, as in what stakeholders in the area think are the weaknesses of the area, what are the challenges, what are the positives of the area. And then we have another section about COVID-19 and the inland region. And most of our reports, one of the very important outcomes, which Rick has mentioned, are the recommendations that come from the reports. And I will go over that a little bit, and Rick will as well. So the first thing I wanted to talk about very briefly, and I know we're a little short on time, so I'll try to make this quick, is one of our issue briefs, and one of the critical parts of our report is housing development, and how has housing development looked in the SCAG region and in San Diego. And in terms of housing construction, we see major disparities between coastal regions and inland regions. And this report, this graph especially shows that, where Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego counties have come back in terms of housing constructions more than 100% or a little less than, or part of the way. Now, when you look at Riverside County and San Bernardino County, which are the blue and orange lines, you see that housing construction post the Great Recession has not come back at all. And that's really interesting, you know, in terms of implications for the economy and for business and for education. Another part of the report I wanted to highlight was RHNA allocations. And we mapped and kind of analyzed the second cycle versus the sixth cycle. The sixth cycle will end in 2029, and we're about to transition into that one at the end of this year. And what we see here and what you'll see in the report, if you download and read it, which, you know, I highly recommend, I'm a little biased, but I think it's great, is that, well, in the report, we break down what was built versus the RHNA allocation. And so these are maps of the RHNA allocations. And if you look in the report, you will see a little bit more about, obviously, what was built, what types of housing were built. And this is really great because it shows the RHNA allocations over time and who met their allocations and who didn't. And what we see basically is that pre-recession, and this will make sense given the last graph, we saw great building pre-recession. And we saw, I think it's Riverside, San Bernardino, and Orange County meeting over 100% of the RHNA allocations. And then as the Great Recession goes on and it continues, and even into now, especially right after the Great Recession, these counties were only building 30 to 40% of their allocation. And obviously the allocations have changed over time due to changing methodologies and everything that goes into the RHNA allocation process. But a really important thing in the current cycle that we're in right now, the fifth cycle, Orange County has built over 100% of their allocation. They have come back completely, yet Riverside and San Bernardino have remained stagnant in that way. So it's very interesting when you consider the implications of that for home construction, for education. You know, we see a great disparity between inland and the coastal regions. And then another thing I wanted to touch on really quickly, as part of a report we published earlier this year, we interviewed 32 people, stakeholders in the inland region, from nonprofits, for-profits to public companies, or, you know, the government employees, city managers, housing developers, about what they thought the challenges this region was facing based on housing development. And so they pointed out things that we all know, like, for example, lack of white collar jobs, or overemphasis on some industries in the IE that maybe are not sustainable. They talked about high mitigation and city fees that are not, you know, if the government, for example, or if a jurisdiction lowers development fees by $50,000, they're likely to profit that money and not pass it on to the consumer. So it's what policies could we instate that will actually help people get into homes, that help housing costs go down, and different things like that. And this section is based on a previous report that we published, which I mentioned. And again, biased, but really great, check it out. And then next, I just wanted to mention a few more of the recommendations in the report, and Rick will get to this in a minute, but we have policy recommendations that some are very in-depth based on our case study series, our report series, and our issue brief series. And we have sets of recommendations on the following topics: pre-approved accessory dwelling units, and that's based off a case study we did with the city of Encinitas down in San Diego, because they have a pre-approved ADU program that did very well. We have a case study on CEQA, and we used an exemplar lawsuit to show CEQA abuse. We also have general housing policy recommendations, and then recommendations from our COVID-19 report series, which we published on the economy, education, as well as housing instability. And we did 2 on housing instability. So I think, and then if you would like to, we have a variety of reports, we have a variety of case studies. So we're going to take a moment to promote ourselves. ICSD.ucr.edu has all of our work, and check it out. And I think that's it. Back to you, Rick.
All right, great. Thank you, Kristen. And again, if any of you have any questions as we go along, feel free to use the chat option, and we'll feed them to the appropriate people as they come in. So where do we go from here? So as Kristen mentioned, the research and the analysis is really blended with some practical policy recommendations for purposes of being able to be digested by members of the public, for policymakers, city and county elected officials, and others. And I also wanted to mention before we get to these recommendations, and then we'll talk about looking forward, that this housing issue that exists now, that has been talked about in great detail over the course of the last few years by the state, this is an issue that has really resulted from decades in California anyways, of not building enough housing. And just to give you an idea, in 2018, Governor Newsom came forward with a goal of expanding housing unit production in California by 3.5 million units by 2025, which was over a 7-year period, an average of 500,000 new homes. That was his goal. Against that goal is the fact that there has not been a single year when the number of new homes built in California has exceeded even 100,000 since 2008. So goals and reality sometimes conflict with each other. Further, there's been one land use analysis that we've seen in California that estimates that California as a whole is only zoned for about 2.8 million new housing units, period. So far short of Governor Newsom's $3.5 million unit figure. And a 2016 report, I think by the McKinsey Global Institute, reported that on a national level, California ranks 49th out of 50 states in terms of per capita housing construction. So we're definitely way behind the curve. And hopefully this background provides that, and the discussion that's contained in the final report can elaborate that on a bit. So we've got 5 recommendations that have come out of the report. I don't think any of these recommendations should cause any of you to faint because you've never heard them before. They're recommendations that have been around for a while, but what's interesting is what we tried to do with our recommendations is to land on the side of providing incentives for builders and for builders, housing developers, for local jurisdictions to want to build more housing. And I know there's a story to tell there, and I think we'll have that conversation with our panel. But basically, the first of our recommendations is to find a way to reward local jurisdictions who meet their regional housing needs assessment milestone allocations, especially for the low and moderate income housing, as that's what is really falling behind. But finding ways to provide incentives with perhaps increased access to infrastructure funding. The second recommendation, again, not something that's new, but we still need to find a way to find some ways to rein in CEQA a little bit, at least for housing projects, particularly for affordable projects. I think Steve PonTell can talk about this as we go through these recommendations and get reactions from our panelists as well as the others. The third, and this was mentioned earlier, there in the interviews that we had with stakeholders, and then the general research of literature shows that cities do typically look for ways to produce revenues for themselves, and housing in many cases is not seen as a revenue winner. Cities each year go to conventions in Las Vegas and elsewhere nationally to try to recruit retail companies to come to their local jurisdictions. I'm not aware of any similar housing conventions where cities go and try to recruit housing developers to come to their area. So there's got to be some way to look at least examining how the fiscal calculus can make housing a revenue winner and then be a little bit more desirable for local jurisdictions who are always hard pressed to meet their budget needs. The fourth recommendation, and this is probably especially timely and is probably getting even more discussion during the pandemic, is we're seeing that there is an increasing amount of underutilized retail, and there's got to be a way that we can start examining statewide and in the inland counties, providing incentives for converting that underutilized retail to housing. Largely the infrastructure is in place, and so it makes it a little bit for an easier conversion that might not normally happen in a greenfield development. And then the last strategy that is here is recognizing that just building more homes doesn't work if people can't afford to buy what's being built. And one of the things that exists in the inland counties is that we've got a lot of homes and a lot of people, but there might not be the income levels that are sufficient enough among our workforce to build the products that can be here. So it causes a sort of a freeze among our housing developer friends, and that they're not going to build anything if there aren't buyers for it. And so there's been some discussion in the 2-county region about the formation of an economic development corporation that would solely exist to pursue large companies and businesses to locate here. And as they do so, they can bring higher salaries that might be able to unleash the backlog of housing that is approved in our 2 counties, but it's just not being built. Next slide, Kristen. And then in talking with our leadership council, the sponsor entities that direct our research, we've come up with 3 or 4 items that they want us to pursue during the course of this next year. One is to continue to take a look at housing affordability, inequalities, and impacts, health impacts, and economic impacts of not having affordable housing in the region. We want to continue to take a look at sustainability in housing, and specifically start to examine how new environmental goals and regulations impact housing construction. How do they impact affordability, and how will that change health outcomes and livable outcomes, especially among lower income folks, because there's some fear that they might be left behind as newer homes that are more expensive are built with the best in energy and water conservation, and then folks that might not have the means to buy the new homes are living in the older properties that are certainly not as efficient or as safe and healthy as the new ones. We've been asked to continue to take a look at COVID related issues as it impacts housing and any new research areas that are there. And then fourth, I think it's important, as this story is told, is to take a look for successes that exist in government and nonprofits and others. So we don't need to start from scratch on figuring some of this out. In many cases, we can take a look at others that have succeeded around us and find out if we might be able to adapt some of the success stories that have existed outside of the region, inside of the region, and throughout the state and beyond, and see if they might be adaptable and applicable here in our two counties in Riverside and San Bernardino. So I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to move on to our panel discussion. And we are very, very pleased and honored to have 4 leaders on this topic that are joining us. Kome Ajise is the executive director of SCAG. SCAG is the largest metropolitan planning organization in the nation, spanning 6 counties and 197 jurisdictions, I think, Kome, or 200. And so Kome has a real keen sense of the disparities in housing throughout the region, and we're really pleased to have him on board. Bill Higgins is the executive director of CalCog. Bill's been with CalCog for, I think, 10 years, just recently celebrated your 10-year anniversary, Bill. So they're not onto you yet. Yeah, so that's good. But we appreciate you being here. And Bill, before being the CalCog executive director, spent a long time with the League of California Cities, now called Cal Cities. And so Bill's here to provide some really good state perspective. Dr. Stephanie Houston has also joined us. She's the San Bernardino, Stephanie, I think it's assistant superintendent of schools, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's correct. Assistant superintendent. Yes.
Okay. Well, but you just got a promotion here. So congratulations.
There you go.
And Stephanie, it's really great to have you here. And we're hoping that you can provide insight on something that sometimes people don't really connect. And that's, the importance of housing in determining educational outcomes and why that's important. Steve PonTell is the president and chief executive officer for National Core, a housing developer that is doing projects not just in California, but I believe also in Texas and Florida. Steve's been in that position, Steve, I think about 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. So we've got really good leadership here who can react to the recommendations in the report, and then we can move on to talk about some other things. So let me just start, and me just start with the first question. I mentioned now twice that these recommendations that we're providing, the 5, they're not necessarily new. They're not groundbreaking. They're not mind-blowing. And they've been around for some time, even if we package them as one. So the question is, I have a number of questions, and I'll ask each of you to respond. One is, what is your observation of the recommendations? Are any of these recommendations something that you think take higher priority than the others, and why? What's missing from this? So what haven't we covered that you think is an important factor in being able to lead to the production of more housing in our 2-county region? And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, inquiring minds want to know, why isn't this working? These recommendations have been around for years, and we're not seeing the kind of progress that maybe we had anticipated. So I'll just start. Anybody want to take a shot at starting it, and we'll go from there. If not, I'll pick somebody.
I can start.
Okay, Kome, thank you so much.
Well, first of all, Rick, appreciate the invitation to join this conversation. I really applaud the center's work on this report. You know, you've added to the discussion on housing policy in a way that I think is unique. Oftentimes, the conversation about housing crisis is always generic and sometimes more anecdotal. And I think your report helps to focus and be more granular about what's going on in the inland region, Inland Empire. I particularly appreciate the focus on some of the details in disparity of home ownership in the area, because I think that's an important thing to begin to look at and address, especially when we come back and talk about RHNA. But it was instructive for me as I was looking through to see the high proportion of multi-generation housing, which I think may be unique to our region in general, because that's one of the arguments we had made with HCD, and how you look at that in terms of overcrowding might be different in some cases. But I just wanted to posit that this is a great report, and look forward to working with you on using that. To your question about why the recommendations are obviously solid because they're things that we've all been thinking about, and they're things that we've agreed are necessary things to do. I think finding a way, it's probably the more difficult part. Finding a way to implement them is probably the more difficult part. How do you incentivize a local jurisdiction to pursue housing as opposed to retail, when in fact we're structured in terms of financing local government on other sources of revenue? So I think it's beyond just incentivizing. I think it's more really totally changing the way we fund local government. I think, and Steve has a thesis on that already, so I know he'll jump on that. So I'm going to stop there on that one. But with regards to rewarding progress on RHNA, it's again that assumes we're talking about rewarding the built units vis-a-vis the RHNA numbers. I think what's missing there, and the reason that might be difficult, is because jurisdictions don't actually do the building. They zone for it, they plan for it, and so to the extent that they've provided all of the incentives and the conditions to allow for housing construction to occur, it may or may not happen. There are other factors that are involved, and especially the builders have to be able to come in and build to at least to the point where they can be profitable, because they're profit-making ventures. So that, I think, is probably one area to look at and to solve for. But clearly, I think one area that's within all of our control on the public side is how do we reform CEQA when it comes to housing. And people think we're talking about getting rid of CEQA. I don't think you want to, because I think that's part of the quality of life issue in California, is to have this disclosure process when things are happening around us, such that there's transparency. I think that's the essence of CEQA. It's the abuse of it, and specifically where it relates to trying to build housing that's so needed when you're dealing with a crisis. So it's that abuse that I think we need to find a way to solve. I'm going to stop there and let others chime in.
So, Rick, can I respond to something Kome said, just because it's, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I don't want to take cities off the hook with regard, they don't actually build housing. Because if a city wants something, it's amazing to see how far they go to make it happen. You know, if a city wants a Costco, you know, they roll out the red carpet. And so the real question, and it ties into the fiscal calculus, is, you know, how to get cities to want housing, to understand the benefits of housing. Because if cities were competing for housing, and I think, Rick, you're the one that coined, you know, if instead of regional housing needs assessment, it was, you know, revenue, you know, generating, you know, new development or whatever, cities would be all over it. And everybody would want more of their share.
Yeah, I think it was retail and hospitality needs assessment, something like that, right?
Yeah. So if you did that, and so cities have, you know, and kind of to your question of what's missing in the research agenda, you know, we understand the politics of it. We understand, you know, the people that don't want housing because they've got theirs and they don't want, you know, all the perceived negatives of more people in their city, et cetera. But, and so, you know, how to deal with the politics and the psychology, you know, around it. And I think the only way to do it is with money. And so if cities perceive that it was in their fiscal best interest to have more housing, they would deal with the politics of it, because cities are municipal corporations. They only survive if they generate revenue. And so, yeah, cities don't build housing, but they could sure as heck cause it to be built if they really wanted it.
And I might just jump in to echo that point, because I was going to raise, I think there is one tool that's emerging that does just that. And we haven't seen it operate yet. And that's the governor 2 years ago in the governor's budget included something that charges HCD to identify a pro-housing community. And HCD is going to be identifying these, and this will be based on policies, not necessarily the number of units that are in the ground, but the regulatory and permitting environment that the city's created for housing. And if you have a pro-housing designation, you'll be getting priority points in different grant applications, like the Affordable Housing Sustainable Community Program. And I think we'll see that grow and grow. So to the previous point, I think that's a step in that direction. We have to see, it's new, it's unproven. We have to see how it works, but that's trying to get in the middle ground that Kome was identified, where the city isn't actually, you know, building, but they are creating the environment like Steve was mentioning. And since this is my opening comment, I also have to give a shout out to UCR, because this year I have my second UCR intern, Celine Huang. And I hired my first UCR Riverside intern, who's full-time now at CalCog, Natalie Zoma. So thank you, Ron, for providing my staff.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. This notion, we've heard this for years. Kome, you've lived it, you know, in this last year or so or two. But it's that continuing argument that was mentioned earlier that, you know, cities can plan for housing, they can zone for housing, but they don't actually build it. So, you know, why should they be on the hook? Do you see any change? Do you see the possibility of RHNA getting more teeth in the future? I mean, right now it's still largely viewed as a planning exercise. So cities have a number that they can plug into their housing elements for certification and things of that nature. But they always kind of step back saying, yeah, but we don't have any control over it. I tend to agree with Steve's comments that if they really want it, they can find a way to do it. So do you see anything changing in RHNA that would put more teeth into it? And then if so, how would or should local jurisdictions react?
I assume that's me.
It's for anybody.
Oh, okay. You want to go for it? Because I think first of all, let's stipulate to the fact that I think RHNA is important, and it's a good process that could be improved on. And the reason I say that is basically, if you're not planning for something, it's never going to happen, right? And so the opportunity to actually plan for housing is the environment that RHNA provides. Is it overmanaged from the state? I think, yeah, maybe, and maybe necessary because of what has not happened over time, and the state continues to feel like they need to step in. And that balance needs to shift, where local jurisdictions need to, in fact, take local control and do housing so that the state does not step in. And so along the lines of what Steve is talking about. I'm not sure how RENA becomes more effective by having more teeth in it, other than if you have a financial incentive that the state can offer, or that can be offered in some other way, such that the jurisdictions that fulfill their RENA objectives have a certain benefit that they derive from it. And of course, if you don't meet your RENA numbers, then there's a disbenefit and there's consequences. Right now, there are really not a whole lot of consequences for not meeting your RENA numbers. There are consequences if you don't submit your housing element on time and get it done. And so we know what those are, and cities do their darnest to get that done. But I think we have to just not. I guess I'm trying to make sure we don't start with the premise that RENA needs to go away. If it goes away, something else needs to be in its place that allows us to plan very intentionally for housing, and also plan across the income categories that are out there, such that we're not just building high-end housing, we also building middle and low-income housing. So I, in terms of incentive, I think that has to be looked at from the perspective of how do we flip how local agencies are financed such that housing becomes an incentive.
Definitely.
Well, and so here's another theory. We're not telling the truth, or we don't have the facts about the consequence of not housing. So people have the perception that if you build more housing, you get more traffic. I believe the truth is you don't build more housing, you get more traffic, because you have the people anyway. The people are already there, and people living in overcrowded circumstances, neighborhoods not by design. You're essentially exceeding design capacity. You design a neighborhood for population X, you put 2X in the neighborhood. The roads, water, sewer, police, fire, parks, schools, traffic, everything else wear out faster, and it's less desirable. And so to be able to have an adequate supply of housing for the people that are living in your community is how you're going to solve the traffic problem. It's how you're going to solve the fiscal problem. It's how you're going to solve the overcrowding problems. It's how you're going to deal with issues like homelessness. And so people that think that if we don't build housing, that people aren't going to come, are not walking around their neighborhoods on a Sunday. You know, I live in Rancho Cucamonga. I can walk around the neighborhoods, and you can identify the houses that have more people living in them than they were designed for. And so we don't have a narrative that really uses facts, or our common phrase science, in order to be able to clearly articulate the consequences of not having an adequate supply of housing. I used to ask the question, do you not care about your children's ability to have housing? And people would look at me in the eye, yeah, not really. So I changed it to, do you at least care about your grandchildren's opportunity to have housing? Because maybe you want your grandchildren nearby, at least. And so, but I think we're completely missing the message, or we're not telling the truth about the consequences of an inadequate supply of housing. And if we could do that, then I think we can begin the process of making housing desirable.
Good point. Dr. Houston, I wanted to get your reaction to the report recommendations, and then maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your experience and thoughts on the importance of housing from an educational standpoint.
Bet. So, I'm always just interested, and I'm always learning, and I'm always listening, and I've been listening very carefully. And, the things that stuck out to me, have to do with, how many people are in homes right now, and this large influx of multifamily, generational kinds of situations, and the impact, especially the impact over the last 18 months or so, when students are in their home doing school. When you have so many people in the home, it might be obvious, maybe it's not, but the noise factor alone of trying to learn in that environment, the bandwidth factor in that environment, as students are transitioning now maybe back into in-person learning. We're not quite sure how that's going to go either. We have quite a few students we think are going to be participating in independent study, and those dynamics are still going to remain. So the idea of housing stability, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has an impact. The cross-sector collaboration that we have happening through what we're doing today, through what we're doing through ICSD, I think is the beginning. I think that's part of maybe what's missing when we're having these conversations. We all use different terminology, different language. So for the folks who are in the development arena and who are the builders or the ones that are doing zoning, well, we don't really speak that language in education, but we can give you the impact when there is overcrowding, when we aren't including the collaborative conversations, so that we really are addressing how everything is integrated. And there's a nexus between housing and education and job quality and environmental stability, the future of work, all of that is connected. And so when we have those kinds of conversations and when we have a common vision, I think that maybe we can break down some of the siloed conversations, the siloed funding streams, and really talk about what is sustainable. What is it that we can do for our region to really improve and change the trajectory? But, from both the K-12 perspective, so you said I'm assistant superintendent within the County Office of Education. So I've seen the impact of, either pre-pandemic or during the pandemic and where we are now. We have a large number of our students who are homeless, a large number of our students who are not counted by HUD, but they're unhoused. And, so you might have a place to sleep, but you're sleeping on a couch, and the impact of that on your education, your behavioral issues that come with that, how self-conscious you are of whether or not you have access to a shower in the morning, maybe things that we take for granted. Those are the types of things, those basic needs that impact absenteeism, that impact ability to learn. It's foundational in sort of everything we do. So I'm a little bit rambling, but I guess the point is the integration of the cross-sector collaboration. That to me is what we've started. We've started those conversations, and the more we can continue those conversations, I think the stronger we're going to be in addressing this overall policy problem of housing.
Yeah, no, definitely not rambling at all. In fact, it's an important point that a lot of people probably don't realize in the Inland Empire, and I think this came from a SCAG report produced a couple years ago on poverty. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kome, but I think the report came out and indicated that 1 out of 4 children in the Inland Empire lives in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
A high number. That's not, it's not just a side number that you say, oh, well, 1 in 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we all know that living in poor quality housing is associated with lower kindergarten readiness scores. We know that homeless students are, less likely to demonstrate proficiency in a number of academic subjects as well. So just from the standpoint of being able to lift the region up economically, you first need to do so from an educational standpoint. And this is a huge issue for
Absolutely.
us.
And when you layer in, our foster youth population and the transient nature of that, and, the displacement of and movement, it is definitely something that impacts, overall well-being.
And just if I could just build on that, one of the things that we've begun to do is when we're doing a housing development, there's a lot of resistance for a lot of reasons. But if we get educators to stand up and support housing, because housing is a critical social determinant of educational performance, we get health professionals to stand up because housing is a critical social determinant of health. We get economic development business people to stand up for the ability to attract and retain employees. And so essentially it's, when housers talk about housing, people hear wah, 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 more housing, more crowding, more greed, more whatever. But when the people that are affected by the lack of housing stand up and advocate for it, you begin the process of getting more community ownership around the need for housing. And so I think it goes back to our narrative needs to shift so that people can understand the only reason we need housing is because we already have the people here. You know, as Lucy Dunn in Orange County says, there's never been one instance of a house having a baby. And so, you know, unless you're going to ban sex, you better build housing. And at the end of the day, let's just think it through and understand what the consequences are.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting. I came across a report, I think it was released today, that talked about how housing costs can affect teachers' attitudes and their own retention. And it was a study done primarily up in San Francisco, so maybe not quite at the scale that goes on here, but it was a really interesting study. And basically,
you can't afford to live in the community that you teach in, right? Is that what you're talking about? That's happening. That happens all over the place, where teachers can't afford to live in the community that they teach in, and the commute time and everything that goes with that. Absolutely. I mean, you know, we can talk about from the workforce and economic development side of things, you know, whether or not we have, I mean, let's just take one sector of the education space. Do we have a pipeline issue or do we have a workforce design issue? I think we have a bit of a workforce design issue, and some of it, a lot of it has to do with some of these things like what you're talking about. How do we attract and retain teachers when they can't even afford to live in the community?
Absolutely. It's a huge point. So it's not that big of a leap to go from children in poverty, homelessness, to even teacher retention, because they're stressed out and anxious about not being able to live near their community. And I think that report indicated that teachers that have a difficult time covering their housing costs actually have a higher level of missed days at work and chronic absences from their job. And they also, they leave.
Right.
So,
And I apologize for talking to, so I'll be quiet after this. So one of my favorite things I like to ask people to live in coastal California is essentially, you know, this is the last place I'd want to live during a disaster, because none of the first responders live here. And you think some fireman's going to leave Temecula and drive to Malibu and take care of you, you know, after the next big earthquake, versus staying home and taking care of their family and neighborhood. And so at the end of the day, it's in communities' own self-interest as teachers and nurses and doctors and police and fire, et cetera, able to live in their communities.
great point. Great point.
Yeah. I was just going to say, it goes to part of the need for making sure that as we plan for housing, we're planning across various income categories in all jurisdictions to be sure that we're catering to the workforces that are endemic in our communities, as opposed to encouraging folks to have to commute from other areas. It's one of the things to point out. I think in Kristen's report, she talked about earlier cycles of RHNA where we expressed our building in terms of vis-a-vis the RHNA number. In fact, when you look at those numbers, we built higher income units more so than the required lower income units. So even though we created more housing than the RHNA numbers asked for, we didn't build proportionate to the numbers that were required for the income categories, and that's very important. And I think it can be overstressed. This need to talk more. Maybe that's an area of research for you guys, Rick. This need to talk about the cost of not housing. I think the superintendent just talked about that. Stephanie just talked about that now about the impact on kids. These are things that are not. They don't show up in your RHNA numbers and when you're talking housing planning.
Well, in literacy, I mean, that's, third grade reading, the numbers of students who are reading at grade level at third grade is, how decisions are made as to where prisons are built, right?
Yep.
So literacy is definitely a driver. So we want to make sure we're driving in the right direction.
There's another Kome that's writing in the chats. That's not me. So I haven't put anything in the chat. There's a clone of me that's writing stuff about Supervisor Jose Gonzalez. That's not me.
I was going to say, you're very insightful, Kome. So whoever Kome is doing a really good job. So I guess our next question: Are you really you, or is there?
I don't know who the second deepfake is. That's responding in my name. I don't actually disagree mostly, but I don't know. I don't know what they're saying.
I was going to ask you to follow up on that statement that says housing and good paying jobs needs to be the new funded transportation project. And I think I know what that person is saying, and I think it's a good idea. I mean,
Yeah.
housing.
Hey, Kome, this is Arnold. I totally apologize. I didn't realize
I
my name
know.
was showing up on that. How come my name doesn't show up? I don't understand that. So, yeah, sorry about that. I don't even know why that's happening.
All right. Arnold, thanks for joining us and impersonating your boss, I guess.
It must be the link they sent me to join the meeting.
Yeah. Go ahead and rename yourself, Arnold.
I will.
While Arnold's renaming himself and trying to dig himself out of the hole of impersonating the executive director of SCAG, well, I want to shift over to Bill. And Bill, I want to get your thoughts on the recommendations in there. Your thoughts on how dire is the problem, and can we incentivize our way out of this with the recommendations are in. The other big question I have for you is you're pretty close to the legislative activities up at the state being housed in Sacramento. Are there legislative fixes in this that may be more important than others in solving the problem? And to what extent do local jurisdictions agree with or don't agree with the legislative fixes that are sometimes imposed, which are often viewed as taking away discretionary activity and land use authority?
And I have about 30 seconds to answer that, right?
No, you've got 10 more minutes.
Let me maybe, and Kome may want to follow up on this, but kind of at the intersection of what we can do and what's coming out of Sacramento, and kind of at the crossroads of your question, is the biggest thing that's actually coming out of Sacramento this year. There's a couple of legislative bills we could talk about, but after we had our initial conversation, I realized it's the budget. And the budget has, $1.75 billion for affordable housing, $300 million to preserve housing. But as Kome knows, there's also a new fund called the Regional Early Action Plan program of 2021, where SCAG will get a fair amount of money to do block grant-like and different programs to encourage transportation housing projects, citing the almost trying to pull up the quote from the chat that Kome didn't make. And I'm encouraged by this for a couple of reasons. One, housing is often, even though we have individual housing elements, we have regional housing markets, and housing is a regional issue. And having a tool, a fiscal tool to incent the right type of projects at the local level to pay for some of the infrastructure that's needed. And it'll be up to SCAG working with its communities to figure out how this funding will be spent. But it's a substantial amount of money that will be coming to Southern California, I think. The legislation that I'm talking about is distributing about $510 million throughout the state to invest in these types of projects, and it's distributed by population, which means Southern California is going to get a big chunk of that. And I'm really encouraged by that type of flexible funding. It's the first we've seen, and $510 million is not enough to solve our problem. But I think we need to look at this pot really closely and see how it performs. And it may be kind of the thing that is able to cross over our different regulatory boundaries that we seem to be locked in, which these 5 recommendations are kind of locked in, fiscal, CEQA, we've seen it over and over. And so I'm encouraged by that. So let me stop there because I just, we only have a few minutes left. But I think that's a unique thing that's coming out of Sacramento this year that address all your questions.
So Bill, just to put a little bit of a context, if we think that out of 3.5 million units, 1.5 million of them have to be affordable at some level, that's $750 billion to build those. Over 8 years is $90 billion a year. And so that, I guess my frustration is the legislature, nobody is even in the realm of reality when it comes to what the need is. That's never even on. So I appreciate what the legislature is doing, but they're missing it by magnitudes that are just incomprehensible.
Well, and my question is, who's missing it? Is it the legislature or is it Californians?
I think it's bold, but the legislator as our leader should at least be putting the right numbers out to say, yeah, we're doing $1 billion here, $1 billion there, but we need 90 billion a year.
If they put that number, I mean, I appreciate, I actually agree with having a discussion about the right number, but practically if they put that number out, they're not getting reelected. And so that's why I'm putting it back on us.
They put 3.5 million units out there. So let's say, what does it take to get, that 3.5 million units built in California? Because I think if we don't frame the right conversation, the RENA allocations in Kome's district alone is going to require $200 billion. And the cities don't have $200 billion. And so, I mean, I'm just throwing it out there to say, let's try and deal with the facts, the real numbers, and then the reality of the fact that we're not going to hit the numbers. And so then what happens?
I think my short response is I agree. And let's make this work. And then we can, if it works and if there's a proof of concept, we can make it bigger.
Okay, yeah, good stuff. We do have one question from one of the attendees. And the person says, in an ideal situation, what would the relationship between the state and county or cities look like when dealing with housing? Should the state even work more closely with Inland Empire? And how does red tape affect the outcome of building housing in Inland Empire? So you guys started talking about this relational issue. It's a relational issue, a PR issue. How can we work better with our leaders at the state level and vice versa?
Well, I'll throw out. So because there's not enough money on the revenue side, then we have to look at cutting the cost side. And that's where local government in partnership with the state could probably cut 50% out of the cost of producing affordable housing, because $500,000-$600,000 a unit is not a sustainable cost. So I would just say there is that. Let's talk about what the numbers are and how we get there and what we can do to lower the costs.
Well, and I think and I agree with Steve, I think we could find ways to lower the cost, but we could also find ways to help the cities actually be a better player at encouraging housing. It used to be that we had redevelopment and that was used to some extent positively. I think being able to encourage development by providing capacity to cities to generate tax increment finance, and that will go to build infrastructure that supports housing, so that we're not having housing be responsible for everything. I think that's part of what we've evolved over time, is housing is responsible for schools and responsible for the fire department and responsible for police and all these other social things. And so that cost that Steve is talking about is because of the requirements we put on housing, because cities don't have anywhere else to be able to go to be able to draw those amenities out of housing that they create. So being able to have a tax increment finance, and I know we've tried to do EIFDs, enhanced infrastructure finance districts in our region for the last 3 years. It has been very tedious. It hasn't been as successful. Maybe we've got a couple in place, which is a really wonderful thing if it works in supporting housing. So that's a relationship the state could really grow on, which would both cut the cost and also increase the revenue to support housing.
Definitely. Bill or Kome or any of the panelists, is there any discussion about bringing back redevelopment in some kind of a revised fashion to help this along?
Maybe we should talk to our school expert. That's an inside tax joke, because for those of you who don't know, redevelopment took away some property tax from schools to fund. So I'm sorry to go insider on redevelopment. Humor is a very narrow platform.
It's right out there with dad jokes. But Stephanie, one of the things that, and this goes back to, let's just be honest about the numbers. We have built new developments where we pay $1 million, hundreds of thousands of dollars in school fees, and not add one net new student to schools. And there are plenty of school districts and schools with declining students where they should want us to build units to generate students for getting ADA and not charge us fees in addition to that. So, I mean, I think the formulas, unfortunately, are kind of locked in, but we need to be honest about what's the real cost and where can we maybe, as Kome said, change some of these formulas.
No, I agree. You know, declining enrollment is it's a statewide problem. So taking a look at that and really doing the analysis would be, I think, a valuable exercise.
Okay. A couple more questions coming in, but I wanted to shift gears real quick and talk about what's getting a lot of press this year. I mean, it kind of went away for a couple of years. It's the drought. Most of the state is in severe drought. Most of the Western United States is in extreme drought. I think there was one small town in Utah that decided to put the hammer down on any new housing developments. I know up in some of the Northern California communities where you are, Bill, there's been some discussion about that. And the PPIC poll that came out, I think today, 63% of California residents very concerned about climate change. 63% also say water supply is a big problem in their region. So are we on a collision course with water over the short or long term, or have we already collided? And how big of a problem does this become in being able to increase the supply of housing in what is an increasingly parched environment?
Well, I'm going to answer it not directly on water because I'm not a water expert, and there's a lot of discussion that you could have about water efficiency use and how you can control that I'm not an expert on. However, what I do think that we have is a housing versus resources issue, and those resources have been changing in an era of climate. So we've seen this whether you're in the coastal range and sea level rise, or if you're in Sacramento where I am, and floods and fire zones and all these different places where we have these housing conflicts with the natural environment. And it's either we build a more resilient housing development, which requires extra costs, or we have to figure out where it's more safe to build. Either way, it's reducing to some extent the flexibility we have for our housing supply. And I don't think we've really had that full question of balancing yet. The state is really good at, delivering us a housing law that's pro-housing, and then, in the next bill, the next day, delivering a fire safety bill that limits housing and a water bill. And then it's up to the local governments and Kome to try and balance and figure out how you achieve those often conflicting objectives. We haven't answered that question. And I think as we move to more limited resources, it's going to be a more significant question.
And I agree with Bill. I would just throw out, and to kind of keep beating the same drum, it is absolutely the case new housing units are more water efficient than old housing units. And it is absolutely the case people are living in overcrowded circumstances, mostly in old housing units, which means they're consuming more water in the old unit than they would in a new unit. So there is an argument that says building new housing will cut down on water use. And same thing with energy use, because overcrowding in an old unit that is not energy efficient, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just hope at some point we can be honest about the science and the consequences and the opportunities and figure out, because housing people should be, it's food and shelter. This is a basic human need. I understand all the other issues and obstacles and people's fear and whatever goes into it, but we as a society have an obligation to house the people that are in our society.
Yeah, Steve, maybe you can talk a little bit about two of the projects that the Corps has recently put in place, one in Rancho Cucamonga, one in Ontario. I think they're both net zero projects. Discuss, how you came to that decision, and are there long-term savings in this? Because what we typically hear is, environmental regulations increase the cost of housing, and so, how do you reconcile that comment, which may be very real, with the energy savings, the water savings that you're also talking about? How did you guys go about coming to that conclusion?
Sure. So just real quickly, by the way, the cities of Ontario and Rancho are two of the cities that actually care about housing and advocate for housing and are seeing housing produced. So I think that's an important dynamic. So my team came to me a year and a half before the building code was going to require us to do certain things on the property, and made the economic case that going net zero was in the long-term economic best interest of the property because of the savings, because of the cost of energy, because of the trends that are occurring in the state of California. So we made an environmental decision for economic reasons. And now that we're ahead of the curve, all of our properties are moving in that direction. And I think if people do the math, and it's not just about adding solar, it's about being smart about how you build. So just 3 quick things: build really tight envelopes. So you're a very high energy efficient from an insulation standpoint, because that then allows you to, number 2, size the mechanical equipment appropriately. Most mechanical equipment is oversized for the development that's done because it's easier that way. And so our team, based on the envelope, sizes the mechanical equipment exactly on, which means it requires less electricity. And the dramatic drop in the cost of solar energy has been absolutely phenomenal. And so at the end of the day, the economics, I think, are driving the change. And I think more and more developers are going to do the math, and we're going to see that occur, which further makes the case why new units are so much more efficient than old units. And we should be advocating for every new unit we can to house people in energy efficient units.
Yeah. Great response. Yeah, I agree with that. 100%. I was looking at the chat questions. I hope that the panelists are having a chance to look at the chat questions as well. I had seen one. Oh, now it's gone. They come and they go.
I read one because I answered it. I think it goes away when you answer it.
Okay. All right.
If it was that one, but I can answer it. I can answer it live if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie. I was just going to ask you to respond to some of these education questions that are popping.
Sure. So I saw the higher ed question had to do with housing and the impact of higher ed on housing. And, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't quite understand is, community colleges. So I serve as a trustee for the San Bernardino Community College District as well. You get a twofer with me. So as a trustee, I've been able to be on conversations around housing and housing instability for our students and the impact on their ability to complete their community college programs in a timely manner. Many of our students, most of our students, majority of students are part-time. They are not able to attend full-time because they have to work, and it's just this cycle. So many of the colleges up and down the state are looking at ways that they can provide for community college students similar housing to what we have in our state university system as well. That would assist, that would relieve quite a bit for on a variety of levels. So know that's happening across the state. So that's something to look forward to as well, specifically in our region. And then I thought there was a question about declining enrollment and why is that a problem? Isn't small class size preferable? Absolutely, small class size is preferable. The funding, though, the funding mechanism, the formula for how school districts are funded is based on students' attendance. And so when students leave the district or there are declines in enrollment, that directly impacts the funding. So the ability to provide the ratios for the smaller class size becomes reduced because the overall budget is reduced accordingly.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, good response. Well, I think we're almost at the end of our time. I wanted to say to Bill Higgins and Dr. Stephanie Houston, Steve PonTell, Kome Ajise, thank you so much for joining us and providing your insights on this important topic. It seems really clear to us that there's a lot to unpack on this issue, and there's a lot more research to do. And it's folks like you that help give us guidance and perspective in doing so. One of the things that I really took away from the comments today is that there really does need to be a narrative on the importance of housing, or Steve mentioned the importance of not building housing and what the impacts really are. And so we need to kind of change that. And I think maybe we'll start looking at that as we move forward with our work. So thank you again for participating. Thank you for your comments and inputs. We appreciate that very much. And to all the folks that joined us today, we thank you for listening. Again, to access the final report, please visit the ICSD website. If you have any questions about the report itself, feel free to email or call any one of the staff. We're listed on the website. And if you're interested in being a part of this center and being a sponsor, feel free to give me a call and I'd be happy to talk about how you can do that. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Wong, see if she has any final comments to make, and then to Dr. Loveridge, and then we'll move on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, all the panelists, and thanks to our audience. This is a great opportunity to share the to share the findings or even deeper thoughts. I know we don't have answers for all of your questions because we are all seeking the answers. But I do think a conversation like this is going to be very beneficial to our community. Thank you for the audience who suggested we should include more people from different sectors. We will do that. Our center is young. This is our first time a community conversation like this. We hope we're going to do more like this because the conversation is very important. And also, thanks the panelists' expert thinking and inputs are very, very invaluable. And I do believe in our audience, we do have many experts there. Please contact us and give us a suggestion, give us comments. We will continue the work like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Loveridge, any final remarks?
No, Rick, this has been, I think, an important presentation and important panel discussion. I guess one of the tests that I have is, do I have 2 or 3 ideas that I didn't have before I came? And I think I have several, but I think what the panelists have demonstrated is that this is not a study of housing is not a closed book. There are a lot of questions that need to be addressed. And so the decision to continue on housing, I think, becomes much more understandable as you listen to the panel discussion today.
Great, agreed. So more to come. We'll do our best to pick up where we left off with the last year, not just with the written reports, but as COVID restrictions continue to be lifted, fingers crossed, we'll get back to some of our seminar sessions on campus, and we look forward to maybe seeing and meeting many of you there. So don't be a stranger. Make sure you let us know other issues that you think would benefit from our research. And with that, thank you for participating in the seminar. Please take a look at the report. And it's been a real pleasure having a discussion with these great panelists. So take care, everybody.